Odon, Indiana is by all definitions the epitome of small-town living. With a current population of less than 2,000 people, the quaint town would seem the most unlikely setting for one of the state's most unusual unsolved mysteries. However, in the summer of 1940, the Hackler family and their home were thrust into the spotlight when a series of unexplainable fires, 28 to be exact, mysteriously erupted inside of the Hackler's farmhouse. On the morning of June 21, 1940, the Odon, Indiana Fire Brigade were dispatched to the Hackler family home. A large farming family, the Hacklers consisted of 59-year-old William Hackler, his wife, 56-year-old Minnie Hackler, and the couple's 7 children: Dale, Garland, Dorothy, Gladys, Harold, Edna, and Roy. Aside from farming, William also worked as a delivery man for the Graham Cheese Factory. Halfway through his morning route, he was alerted that a small fire had broken out at his home. After being assured the fire had caused no real damage, William continued his delivery route. At 10 a.m., William returned home. His wife Minnie told him about the strange fire that had occurred. She explained it had been discovered by their daughter Dorothy when she found a strip of wallpaper on fire in an upstairs bedroom. Having no electricity in their home, the responding fire department theorized the wall perhaps covered an old chimney. However, after tearing away the plaster, they found nothing. Satisfied that they had eliminated the threat, they returned to the station. As Minnie finished telling of the morning's events, suddenly, and right before their eyes, another small section of wallpaper, this time in the couple's bedroom, located on the opposite side of the house, began to ignite. Despite the family's efforts to douse the small fire, it began to spread. The Odon Fire Department were summoned once more, and again extinguished the blaze. The Hacklers' troubles were far from over, however. Over the next few hours, fires erupted from behind a bookshelf, on a single stair leading to the second floor, on several strips of wallpaper, and in the middle of the living room floor. A calendar, a bedspread, and even a pair of William's overalls that had hung on a door went up in flames. Word of the mysterious event quickly spread through the small town, causing curious locals to flock to the scene. While inside, 2 neighbors of the Hacklers watched as a pair of curtains suddenly burst into flames. Once extinguished, curtains on the opposite side of the room mimicked the behavior. Later, a small group of townspeople watched as a single book began to smolder. Once opened, it was found that only one chapter, located in the middle of the book, had burned. A biology textbook. The title of the burned chapter was Unknown Friends and Foes. By evening, the Hacklers, tired and defeated, gathered their most precious belongings and, along with their blankets, made camp on the home's front lawn. That day, 28 fires in total occurred in the Hackler farmhouse, the last occurring just before midnight. Though it had sustained some damage, the Hackler farmhouse remained mostly unscathed. The family, however, demanded answers for the prior day's events. A magnitude of theories were presented, including the home's lightning rods had charged nails in the home, causing them to heat up and ignite the wood, or an unknown flammable poison, glue, or chemical had, in the day's heat, suddenly caught fire. Others offered up theories about magnetic fields, spontaneous combustion, and even the possibility that the entire event had been a hoax, somehow concocted by the Hacklers themselves. However, when none of the suggestions could be proved with any certainty, whispers of the supernatural began. The Hackler home had been the scene of more than one tragic event. The 2-story farmhouse had been constructed by the Ketchum family just after the end of the Civil War. Sadly, a burning fever suddenly claimed the lives of all 5 members of the family. After the death of the Ketchums, the home and land was purchased by the Wilk family, Andrew, his wife, and the couple's 2 sons. When one of the Wilk sons was killed in a hunting accident, Andrew ordered him to be buried in a glass-topped coffin on the property, so his face would always be visible. After his son's death, Andrew declared himself and his family to be spiritualists. He claimed his deceased son spoke to him, and would frequently make his presence in the home known through a series of knocks. After Andrew and his wife passed away, the son's remains were moved from the property to a nearby cemetery. Less than a week after the mysterious fires, and still with no explanation, the Hackler family moved out of the house. Piece by piece, they deconstructed the farmhouse, taking the salvageable wood and opting to rebuild elsewhere. So what really caused the Odon fires? Was it a hoax? Some natural occurrence? An angry spirit? Unfortunately, whatever your opinion may be, the mystery will most likely forever be unsolved. I'm Jallomoth, curator of all things curious, but what I just read to you was not my own words. This was all a post I had found late one night from TheBonesofAutumn, a fellow enthusiast of the curious, and the author of both Unsolved Indiana and Cold Case Indiana. This telling of the story was my, and likely now your first exposure to this strange case from 8 long decades ago. But thankfully, that means I can't be the only one who finds this story massively intriguing. Was any of this true? I needed to know more. I think in any mystery, the setting is very important, and that's definitely the case here with Odon. The small, tight-knit area, named after the ship name of 2 of its old residents, has always had a bit of a problem drawing people in. Its population hasn't even doubled in the 83 years since this incident took place. Back when they conducted the census in 2010, there was just shy of 1,400 people living in Odon, many on the same few streets tightly kept together. To call it a small town would be a bit of an understatement. To really put it into context how remote Davis County is in comparison to more populated areas of Indiana, of all 7 municipalities inside, Odon has always been the second largest. There's Washington with around 12,000 residents, but the 6 towns beneath it struggle to even get anywhere near 1,000 citizens. Odon really does seem like such a quaint little outlier hidden in the boot of Indiana. And you've got to think, all these populations were much smaller 4 generations ago. With that context, it really doesn't seem that likely that the Hacklers were doing this to become some sort of local legend. From the sounds of their reaction to this whole ordeal, down to the dismantling of the entire house and them leaving, it seems the Hackler parents and their 7 children were highly disturbed by the events that happened to them on that hot summer day. If this was all for money or attention, you'd think they would have kept the house up indefinitely as a haunted attraction like hundreds of other places across the United States have done. Meanwhile, I can't even find exactly where this even took place. We'll touch more on that later and what it could imply, but let's keep thinking about this. Even if they did lie somehow, the testimony of the neighbors seeing these spontaneous combustions and the over 100 firemen from 2 different cities fighting these fires for more than 16 hours straight would probably be too big to just make up, right? If this was all false, the people would have come out by now and said there was no Hackler family. But sure enough, there definitely is, or at the very least was, a Hackler family. Now, I would love to hear some accounts from anyone who was there in retrospect, or just relatives of these people recounting what they've heard about the event. I mean, there should be hundreds of people out there who have a grandpa or great-grandpa who fought some of the fires in the farmhouse on that strange day. But it's really hard to find any talk about what happened past what the papers ran from the time. And if you ask me, newspapers from 80 years ago are not as reliable of a source as you may think. Papers have been sensationalizing stories for about as long as they've existed, but let's take a look through some of these texts anyway, and try to see if we can glean anything interesting from them. The first one that caught my eye, Collier's The National Weekly, linked in Autumn Bones' post, gave me some information I hadn't known yet. For instance, we know the first fire started around 8 a.m. near the top of the 2-story home's stairs. Since the firemen debunked the chimney theory, and the house that had stood since the end of the Civil War, built by the Ketchum family, didn't have any electricity or even power lines around for miles, so the kitchen is probably a good suspect for alarm, right? Well, of all 28 supposed fires, not one had happened in the kitchen. Well, there goes thinking it had much to do with their gas oven. Speaking of this Ketchum family, I was a little skeptical about the legitimacy of this previous hauntings element of the story, but lo and behold, because of the independent research of some people online, I can semi-confidently say that the Ketchums and Wilkes families did both really exist. Still don't know about the validity of Ketchum burying his son with a glass-windowed coffin that acted as a portal to let him haunt the whole house, and randomly get fire powers, but only for one night. It really seems to me that the only people that could really solve these mysteries are the residents of Odon, and the reliability of even their claims gets fainter and fainter with each passing generation. Something that did make me a little skeptical about this first paper's legitimacy was all these insurance ads down here at the bottom of the page. A story about a house burning 30 different times randomly in a day, then an insurance ad right after? And you expect me to believe the story was not only real, but not tampered with to sound a little more extreme than it was? This struggling family of 9's farmhouse caught fire 28 times in 16 hours. It could happen to anybody. This paper is so close to saying, this could happen to you, folks. It literally says at the end, moral, insure in the Travelers, all forms of insurance, the Travelers Insurance Company. Yeah, I don't know about this lead, but let's keep looking. From this first paper, we can also glean some more information about the nature of these fires. For instance, the calendar from the story wasn't slowly lit and burned like one may assume. It apparently rapidly puffed into a ball of smoke and fire. And what about that ever so curious detail of the chapter of the book burning? The reason this especially stood out to me is if this whole story was a ruse to get insurance sales, why this paranormal angle? You'd probably have an easier time getting people to believe spontaneous combustion exists over ghosts. Although, I don't know, the 40s was a different time. But to refresh your memory, this paper makes the creepy connection to the chapter that had burned, being called Unknown Friends and Foes, from a biology textbook. The title Unknown Friends and Foes seemed like a strange name for a bio chapter, but perhaps it was about bacteria or viruses. Either way, it was nothing religious or anything from what I can gather, but like I said, it was the 40s. I don't know what their curriculum looked like, but unfortunately, in the last 80 years, not much has changed with this story. Many people, just like then, have their own theories as to what happened that day, such as glue from the wallpaper heating up in the 100-degree summer heat, maybe perhaps even magnified by the old glass windows. Apparently, old glass that had a circular pattern could magnify the rays of the sun, and at a certain point of the day would be shining heat lasers into the house practically. If this bright, hot, concentrated ray of sunlight were to hit some sort of flammable chemical glue used in the wallpaper, it could have caught fire. But there's quite a bit of evidence proving this bizarre theory false right from the gate. First of all, from what we know, the first two fires took place on opposite corners of the entire house. The first of which being on what I assume is a staircase in the interior of the house, likely with no windows around. How could both sides of the house be getting hit with rays from the windows mere hours apart if it's supposed to be rays from the sun? Also, the final fire happened a little bit before midnight. The sun definitely would have gone down by then, even in the longer days of the summer. Also, if the windows were some sort of problem, 28 problems in 16 hours to be exact, why would they just now act up? This house had stood for decades already with no issue. And I don't think this was like the hottest day of all history or something, because more cases like this would have happened. Plus, I don't think a family of 9 could just afford to replace every window of their house at once. And if they did, then this happened, they probably would have came to the conclusion that their new windows were the cause. I mean, what does this theory even really imply? No glazier worth his salt would sell a family that many faulty windows at once. Maybe the worst window maker of all time conned the Hackler family into killing their entire house with his death ray glass, but this theory just does not seem very plausible to me. Well, if it wasn't the windows, could it have something to do with the wallpaper? Seemingly most of these fires just ignited directly on the surface of their walls. But once again, the first two blazes were on opposite ends of the entire house, and this wallpaper wasn't exactly new if I had to guess. So why then and there did they burst into flames 30 times? This wallpaper glue theory gets less likely when you consider the fires that ignited in the middle of the floor, or on the floor under a bookcase, and on the pages of a closed book which was in a closed drawer in the bookcase. If you remember, the curtains went up in flames as well as the calendar on the wall. Shortly after the curtains went up in flames, they were supposedly ripped from their curtain rods onto the floor. This is a very intriguing aspect of the story, and we know there were at least 3 people in the room at the time this happened that had witnessed it. Aside from Minnie Hackler and any of the other 8 members of the family, 2 women, the Hackler's neighbors, were in the room with them trying to help figure out what this issue could be. That's a lot of people to see curtains burst into flame and then get ripped from the wall. That's enough to send anyone into a spiral. I'd say doubly so for someone from a time where TVs were a new, incredible invention that very few, very rich people had. Another theory that can be debunked pretty easily is the one from the story about electricity charging nails in the home. This falls apart when you know that there purportedly hadn't been storms in the area for quite a while. Now, I will say, things bursting into flame and leaving their surroundings completely unharmed makes some really imaginative people want to call upon spontaneous combustion theory. But that is a supposedly hyper-rare event, and there was over 24 in one house in one day. Come on. Could it have been some natural gas leak? Not likely. The problem with every single theory is that nothing can seem to explain why everything started at 8 AM, ramped up until 11 PM, then completely stopped. How in the world could something this centralized happen? Please give me a statement of someone from near Odon or a few solid pieces of evidence, because I'm starting to seriously doubt something like this could ever happen. It's a freak occurrence amid freak occurrences. Even the theory of an arsonist is practically impossible. Even if it was one of the Hacklers themselves, many people, including the best firemen the city had, were there and supposedly saw these fires erupt. They were studied for a week, and not a trace, not a singular scrap of evidence could be detected. I suppose it doesn't help that 1, the quote-unquote crime scene in this scenario was constantly being tampered with dozens of curious townsfolk flooding in and out, and 2, even if it wasn't, 1940s forensics was really not it. But from glue to arson to electric fields, they never even seemed to entertain that these trivial things could be the cause. The Hacklers had been pushed much farther than rational thought could take them. They came to the conclusion that something far more sinister was occurring. And do you blame them? In this second newspaper clipping, we can actually see some words from the owner of the home and father of the Hackler family, William. He said, "I knew nothing about a fire at our place until I arrived at Odon and they told me about a fire truck that had been out there." He also said, "Not once during the year have we been disturbed. Of course, there's always been a superstition around here that the place was haunted, but I don't believe in such things. Or at least, I didn't believe." So this second paper, much like the first, is giving us some really interesting answers to questions, and more questions with no answers. It does let us know that the Hackler family stayed in town. They kept their same plot of land, but demoed the house to build a new one a few hundred meters away. Never to have another issue like this again. Something I found kind of intriguing was this part about Odon in the paper. Once again, William said, "I knew nothing about a fire at our place until I arrived at Odon, and they told me about a fire truck that had been out there." So William was a delivery man for a dairy company doing his routes, which is why he was absent for the first part of the day, but he says he had to get into Odon to find out about the fire trucks out there at his house. Now, how would the people of Odon know? I don't know. It's a small town, word travels fast, but the implication here is that this event didn't happen in Odon. Odon was just the nearest, biggest place to tie the story to. Apparently the Hackler house was 3 miles northeast of Odon. I don't exactly know where that places the grounds of the house today, but it couldn't be too far from other people because the 2 women who saw the curtains ignite in the living room were described as the Hacklers' neighbors. Now, in rural Indiana, that could mean she lives 2 miles up the road. I really don't know. But the more I read, the more I couldn't help but think, are the Hacklers still there, north of Odon? I wanted something, a person posting on Facebook about what happened to their grandparents' house, pictures of the foundation, a confirmed location that can just place where this all happened, and maybe most of all, where are the Hacklers today? If you do still happen to be skeptical of this entire story, I'll say again that the Hacklers were at the very least real people, and every one of their gravestones is archived online. William had passed away in 1948, just a few years after the fires had happened. He was succeeded by his wife and 7 children, the last of which to pass was Gladys back in 2001.
From what I can find, and this could be inaccurate, only the oldest son Roy and middle child Dorothy had any children, and those children may not have had children of their own, or ones I can find. I'm not sure if there are any surviving relatives of the Hackler family who still know what elements of this story are truly factual. It appears that both parents themselves had plenty of siblings, and so what I think are the Hackler's cousins do have surviving family today. But who knows if they still do or ever did reside anywhere near Odon. The truth is, many aspects of this story have just been lost to time. And the more you search, the more simple contradictions you'll find. Some reports of the story detail the family having 5 children instead of 7, 2 of which being William Jr. and Virginia, who were not even a part of the original list of Dale, Garland, Dorothy, Gladys, Harold, Edna, and Roy. One reporting of the story will say the event happened on June 21st, 1940, and another will say April 19th, 1941. In C.O. Turner's coverage of the story, another insurance company, we can get a clearer look that says this took place near Odon. Once again, the story is being used to sell fire coverage. And this is all coming from a Masonic temple building, a real good sign. Can we really validate any of this? Many towns across the Midwest are basically tourist traps, so is this all just a gimmick to bring more people into town? Maybe the Masons thought it would be a good idea? The population did boom between the census of 1940 and 1950, the time of the story, but I can't say it's because of this. And boomed might be too generous of a word to describe the jump, but it was the biggest rise in population Odon has ever seen. Something I wish wasn't the case is that we don't have many local small-town newspapers for the incident. These ones were national releases, which in my mind means it's more likely to be hyperbolized. The fact that the only big remaining coverage of this event is being used as an insurance ad makes me want to question some of these numbers at the very least. Was there really 100 firemen? Was there really 28 fires? I mean, I've seen some reports say 25. How much of this is real? Any of it? I don't know. At the end of the day, it's very hard to say this story has no truth behind it. Because in such a tight-knit community of really just a few hundred people, everyone would have known each other. This family had jobs, friends, classmates, none of which have come out to falsify any of their turmoil.
It's a little weird that I can't find any retellings of this story from people online, but I'm not even close to the best sleuth in the world. I care more for the learning about what happened, not exactly trying to influence its future. Also, this is totally my opinion, but I find it more likely that the humble residents of the town would rather forget this cursed moment of their history. Most people in the world only know Odin because of this story, so if it was false, you'd think the mayor would do some sort of press release or go online and say, hey, we're not haunted, come on in. But like I mentioned earlier, they could keep this story going and not shoot it down because it drives more people in. And they can't exactly turn it into a tourist trap if it never happened. That's why there would be no site. But the Hackler, Wilkes, and Ketchum families were real. So why make the story up about them? This is truly what makes me think the story is likely, strangely, true. At least in some way. Maybe there's no site because the Hacklers just want to forget this and keep to themselves and stop having everyone and their mother come bother them on their farm. It being private property makes some sort of sense why it's unknown, especially now that the family is likely gone. It could be any number of random farmhouses out there, be it abandoned or still occupied to this day. Who knows, if there's a person living there today, they may not know that the house they live in is built with the gutted materials of one of the most haunted homes in the Midwest. Remember earlier when I said Washington was the closest city bigger than Odin? According to their paper about this incident, it was all real. And not only did the fire department of Odin see it, but dozens of members of the fire department of Elnora who examined the home both between and after these incidents. The home was even somewhat open the week following this event before it was torn down. The family slowly took all of their belongings from inside as hundreds of curious locals came to do their own examinations of these scorch marks dotted across the house. Something of note to me is that because of the nature of being such a small town, many of the firefighters who were desperately scrambling to even understand what was happening to try to help this baffled family only became more and more confused, likely in part to the fact that many, if not all of them, were just volunteers. Who knows what they were? Policemen, farmers, delivery men, people from all walks of life. A lot of them could have been Masons, none of which with an ounce of a clue what was happening to the Hackler's home. But no matter the cause, by the end of that fateful night, the house still stood, victim to a highly centralized freak occurrence, the likes of which have never been seen again. Whether you're a skeptic or a spiritualist, it's hard to call this case anything short of bizarre. With no major leads, no solid explanation, not even many potential explanations, whether you believe in the hundreds of people's testimonies or think these papers made up testimonies and jacked up numbers to make for a better story, these were real people with real lives. And no matter what way things went down, they've found themselves cemented as the stars of one of the most unnatural events in the Midwest's history. How much of the story do you believe? I'm an okay show host, but a bad detective, so maybe there's more under the surface that I simply couldn't find. The questions I still have are, where are the Odin news reports about this incident? Pictures of the house? This photo was in one of the news reports, but if you look close, it's clear that this is a drawing. Why was the location of the home never reported? This is weird to me, because if this story is fake to draw people in, have a site to visit, put a gift shop next to it. Call up Zach Baggins, infinite visitors glitch. But they didn't. Was it for the Hackler family's safety? Was it because this never happened and there was no site? Something that would oddly give this more credence, even if it was strictly emotional, would just be to see a photo of what the Hacklers looked like. Now, I know cameras weren't something many people had in the mid to early 1900s, but almost everybody at the time did have at least one family photo from an event or something. And the Hacklers lived a good way toward the turn of the century, yet with little evidence they even existed past where they've been buried. It seems likely now that the only people with the power to answer these questions are the locals of Odin. The oldest and wisest members of this small community may be the only holders of anything close to a true answer. I would opt to just leave them alone though, instead of trying to bug a bunch of normal small town folk. Firstly, because that's just the nice thing to do, and second, because I like that it's unsolved. I'm the curator of the curious, not the curator of the stuff we for sure know about. Let me know if you enjoyed this journey through the depths of the Midwest as much as I did. To my patrons like Hoops McCann, Lil Quack, Noisy Pitta, Nat, Jaguar, and Porsche, thank you. Happy Jalloween, and stay curious.